work within the normal confines of the international political system through the UN and through the United Nations and so forth. In other words, it's not a supremely radical organization that seeks to completely undo the nation state of Egypt and rebuild it along any specific lines, including a caliphate and anything that people might suspect. On the other hand, as normal, and I use that in a very particular sense, but as normal as it is, it's also not a normal political movement. It's based on a religiously inspired modern ideology that is quite distinct, I have to say, from the normative traditions of Islam in Egypt, and it eventually seeks to change the nature of religion in Egypt. It is a movement that, as a result of its history over the past 80 years, is intently given to considering itself under threat and under threat constantly, and that defines a lot in terms of how it deals with internal dissent as well as with external political groupings. Internally, the Brotherhood does not brook any dissent, and indeed some political groups have emerged from the Brotherhood as a result of that in just the last 18 months. Externally, the past 18 months have also shown that alliances can be engaged with, but where the Muslim Brotherhood holds the upper hand, because the world is against them. At a key revolutionary moment in Egyptian history, a movement that feels against them is unable to genuinely enter into relationships of common cause and create a government of national consensus. There's one more unique aspect to this period of Egyptian history, and that is indeed the revolution itself. The revolution was supported by an overwhelming majority of the Egyptian people. It was, as the perhaps tired but nonetheless accurate cliché goes, a people's revolution. Gallup polling figures taken multiple times during 2011 and also through 2012 show that more than 8 out of 10 of Egyptians supported the uprising in January 2011. It was that wide acceptance of and support for the revolution that laid down the legitimacy to enact change, to fulfill the revolution's demands. However, that legitimacy is very much linked in Egypt with the existence of an authority that enjoys similar legitimacy. Otherwise, that authority is simply acting on the basis of normal politics and not revolutionary politics. And the rules of the game are different depending on what sort of politics people are engaging in. And this perhaps is the crux of the matter when understanding the nature of the Egyptian political context at the moment and what happened with the attempt to dismiss the Prosecutor General. If this is indeed a revolutionary political period, then special, extraordinary measures can be taken to bypass the normal system. And such measures would be in keeping with the legitimacy lent to the ruling authority. For example, the forced resignation of Hosni Mubarak by the armed forces, who undoubtedly had overwhelming support for their action when they pushed this through. The departure from much of the national scene of the military earlier this year likewise enjoyed broad-based legitimacy precisely because it took place as a result of the military choosing to depart. And the military is extremely popular, not because Mr. Morsi wanted it to depart, despite what some people might have thought. If, however, the reigning authority does not have such overwhelming support, such overwhelming buy-in from the population at large, and most importantly from the political establishment at large and the political spectrum, we see within Egypt that that lack of revolutionary legitimacy will vastly limit its capacity and its ability to enact change. Mr. Morsi's government is still the legitimate authority, of course, but it will only be able to then engage through legally legitimate means, not revolutionary superlegal means. And herein lies the rub, which is key to understanding Egypt's present predicament. When Mr. Morsi attempted unsuccessfully to dismiss the Prosecutor General, many defended him as trying to achieve a demand of the revolution. However, as President of the Republic, he quickly found that he did not have legitimacy to dismiss the Prosecutor General. He had no legal grounds, even as President, to do so. And he had no extra legal grounds, i.e. revolutionary legitimacy, to do so. Instead, his move was perceived, and rightly so, as the presidency attempting to enforce its own vision upon the judiciary, displacing the former regimes through extra-legal measures. And he failed, as the judiciary responded almost unanimously, and other political forces did not stand by Mr. Morsi in trying to force the Prosecutor General to stand down. Now, none of this sat well, particularly well, with the Muslim Brotherhood. One of its key leaders in the Freedom and Justice Party, Hatem Abdul Azim, for example, declared some of the judiciary's politicized members believe they can have power over all other branches of government, and we cannot build a democratic system without addressing that issue. It may not necessarily be the Islamist project or Morsi's project, but judges oppose any radical change in the political process, and they seek to hinder the revolution and maintain things as they were under the former regime. End quote. But it is precisely radical change, however, that the president is unable to do, and will probably be unable to do for quite some time, if not forever. Mr. Morsi governs Egypt as a legitimate president, but a legitimate president curtailed by the law and the existing system. And moreover, he suffers from the absence of a parliamentary check upon him. And that is something that we should consider to be a handicap, because it makes him vulnerable to the accusation of heavy-handed authoritarianism, whether he's guilty of it or not. And finally, he emanates from a movement that is suspected by different portions of Egyptian society of not being entirely committed to the notion that Egyptians all share the same civil liberties in Egypt. He does not, therefore, govern Egypt as a revolutionary president, one that might go above and beyond established procedures to institute a truly non-corrupt and independent judiciary, for example. His president was not endowed with that legitimacy. It's business as usual in Egypt in that regard. Adil Ramadan, a lawyer with the Egyptian Initiative for Human Rights, for personal rights, notes it is too late for the Muslim Brotherhood to take revolutionary measures vis-à-vis the judiciary. And he went on record to say any exceptional measure, such as sacking the public prosecutor or certain judges, should have been made before a new political system was established. Now we have a legal legitimacy and a political system that is somehow stable. We have a president and a prime minister, so you can't just put us back on the revolutionary track. End quote. That argument goes on to say that revolutionary discourse may be used by the Muslim Brotherhood to try to justify certain moves, but they're not necessarily successful. The die, in one sense, was cast when the Muslim Brotherhood accepted the transition from military rule to normal political life. As such, trying to engage in radical extra-legal change without a widely built consensus will always be taken in bad faith. Any move in that regard will not be seen as moving forward with revolutionary aims, only be perceived as strengthening and deepening the Muslim Brotherhood's political hegemony and sidelining other political forces. With all this considered, Mr. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood at large have a choice as the largest power brokers in Egypt's political landscape. Either the revolution continues or it doesn't. Many believe it ended on the 11th of February when Mr. Mubarak was forced to step down. Many believe it ended when Mr. Morsi took office. Others still believe it ended at other points, but they all believe it ended. And if it ended, then revolutionary political governance is no longer applicable. Revolutionary legitimacy is no longer there. And Mr. Morsi has to go through established systems without trying to circumvent them, as he tried to do with the Prosecutor General. If the revolution, however, continues, then Mr. Morsi has a very serious task ahead of him. Because the 25th of January revolution was a people's revolution. And achieving revolutionary legitimacy in order to achieve revolutionary demands would require Mr. Morsi to act in concert and in conjunction with other political forces in order to speak on behalf of the overwhelming majority of Egyptian citizens who supported the revolution on the 25th of January. In other words, he would have to engage in a government of national consensus and draw in, genuinely so, different parts of the opposition that supported the revolution. if he did so, then it might be a temporary conglomerate of political forces, almost definitely a temporary grouping, but that conglomerate might be able to enact thoroughly revolutionary changes for the betterment of Egypt as a whole. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that's particularly likely, and as such, I do think Egypt is likely to see more politics as usual. As a matter of fact, judging by the last few months and the majoritarian impulses of the Muslim Brotherhood, such as how they've tried to form the Constitutional Assembly twice, it will probably be not just politics as usual, but it's probably going to be more partisan, more majoritarian, and more based on narrow self-interest than a normal political system. Now, I can't end my talk on a note like that because you all look like you're about to slit your wrists. And I don't think that anybody should be particularly pessimistic about the future. People should be realistic about the future. One thing that I think is very important, and people who have been to Cairo or other parts of Egypt before and after the uprising, I think will testify to, Egypt has changed. Egypt has gone through a change. It's real. And it affects the way that Egyptians live and affects the way that Egyptians organize. I saw an Egyptian diplomat over the last couple of days, and he gave me his card. And he said, please write to me. My personal email is on this card. I said, oh, so this is the one that if I write to you on, I'm not going to get arrested for the stuff that I say later. I said, no. Those days are over. Now, he was joking, but there's actually a serious sort of fact behind that. I could have given this speech in Cairo today, and I wouldn't have to be worried. 2 years ago, that would not have been the case. And I firmly believe that the revolution in Egypt continues. It may not continue in the presidency. It may not continue in parliament. But it definitely continues in the lives of many political forces in Egypt and in the intentions and the desires of many Egyptian citizens who simply won't let their revolution have been for nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Can you elaborate more on what you feel the major differences are that have changed as far as positive changes and negative changes? I'm going next month, and I'm going to stay for 6 months, so I want to be ready and know like how I can contribute somehow, and if it's going to be okay for me to be politically active there.
Bisalam. Shall we take a few at once?
Will you expand on opportunities that you see there?
What I want to know is what's the difference in the Islam of the Egyptians and the Islamic, I guess, ideology that this current government represents? You kind of alluded to that, but can you elaborate on that a little bit, perhaps?
Okay. Well, yeah. We'll answer those and then we'll come back. So, you're going to Egypt next month. Inshallah. Bisalam. So, things that have changed and things that have gotten worse. I'll go with the bad stuff first. Polarization in Egypt on a political level is really quite intense. That's something that we didn't see prior to the revolution because nobody was interested in getting involved in politics. The bad effect of sort of opening up the arena for discussion means that polarization has really taken off. It's not sectarian in political terms. That's another issue altogether. But it's very, very harsh. Today, there was a huge protest in Tahrir that was explicitly about being against the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, I understand why that is. I appreciate why that is. it has to move beyond that. It can't simply be against something all the time. And you see that very, very clearly on all levels. I mean, I've been pretty harsh on the Brotherhood in my comments today, and the reason why is because they are actually in a position of authority. If they weren't, I probably wouldn't talk about them that much. And in different venues and at different times, I might spend much more time criticizing the quote-unquote liberal contingent within Egypt. And I put them in quotation marks because most of them are not liberal at all. They're quite fascistic. But anyway, the polarization is quite ugly. So I would watch out for that for when you go. What's good, though, is that you can actually go and have that discussion. And you can talk about that discussion. And you can be engaged on all of those levels. And sometimes it can get a bit ugly. I mean, last Friday, there was another protest in Tahrir. And it came to blows. This Friday, the Brotherhood was smart enough not to actually come to the square. And last Friday was ridiculous. I mean, they are the party in power, and people that were linked to the Brotherhood were throwing rocks at people within the square. I mean, you guys are in power. What are you doing? That didn't happen today. They were probably very busy trying to elect a new party chairman, but that's still good news. But the reality is that when you walk into Cairo airport, when you land, unless there's something about you that I don't know, you shouldn't be pulled across and taken into CID or into the mukhabarat for being interested and involved in politics. And that, I think, is very positive. Another thing that's very positive is that people have begun to consider that many of the founding myths that they've been raised with aren't actually true. So the myth of the angelic military, for example, that has never done anything wrong and is, an army of all heroes, and there's no corruption, and there's, they're completely above water in every single sense of the word. That's taken a hit. People are curious about, okay, where does the money go? Is corruption really so absent, and so on and so on. So the openness is definitely there. You'll see a lot of things there that. When was the last time you were in Egypt?
So I was there during the
Okay.
That's what I was saying. Like, for me, it's going to be a big deal to see because I haven't been there since the revolution. So I left right.
You left right afterwards. So there's some things that you'll see very much in front of you that you probably won't like. Traffic got worse. Traffic got a lot worse.
How can that be possible?
See, you asked that, and you're going to have a real shock when you go. But no, that's definitely the case. Public services have dropped, and yes, they weren't particularly good to begin with. We know that, but they've gone a bit down the drain as well. Things are picking up a little bit in that regard, but things like garbage collection has been quite bad. It's getting a little bit better, but this is what happens when you have a revolution without thinking about what happens next. But again, these are things that can be fixed. I mean, lots of these problems can be fixed. We didn't suddenly have 1 million more cars arrive on the streets of Cairo. It was exactly the same. But people just didn't want to follow the traffic laws. So there are things that can be. The police have returned to the streets, not in the way that they should have, and not as complete as they might have been beforehand. That's good and bad. People don't respect the police as much as they did. Again, good and bad. So you'll see it. And I would be surprised if you didn't come away feeling after that 6-month period that there are serious changes. And this is one of the reasons why I was very much in support of Mohamed Morsi winning against Shafiq in the presidential election. Because in the midst of that dynamic where Mohamed Morsi is sort of at loggerheads with different parts of the civil establishment, it allows for room to maneuver. Room that would not have existed if Ahmed Shafiq had won. And Ahmed Shafiq would have taken the country into a very different direction. You asked about the difference, opportunities. Do you mean opportunities for Egyptians or?
Well, for me, for example, you mentioned I think in what I read that you were going to talk about some opportunities that will be happening. So, just wanted to expand on that.
Okay. Well, the opportunity I think for Egyptians is to really reform the way that that the country works. There are huge problems in Egypt around the distribution of wealth, around minimum wage, around corruption, and about changing the system so that it really does respond to public opinion and represent Egyptians. Those opportunities still exist. The fact that the election went the way that it didn't make anybody happy. Nobody wanted the final round to be between Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood and Ahmed Shafiq, who represented the old regime. But the fact that Mohammed Morsi did win, or rather Ahmed Shafiq lost, did allow for the possibility that there can be room for maneuver to achieve some of those goals in the future. So those are some of the opportunities that are in front of Egyptians. But again, this political polarization is quite insipid and is going to hold a lot of people back. People do have to move beyond defining themselves in contradistinction to something else. The Muslim Brotherhood doesn't have much of a political program, but they have a much more well-developed political program as compared to a lot of the non-Islamist groupings, many of whom got into politics in order to keep the Brotherhood out. You do have an established leftist contingent within Egypt. It's very small. You have an extremely small inheritor of a liberal Egyptian legacy, but most liberal Egyptians, if I can be frank, are liberal in terms of their social lifestyles, not in terms of their political ideology, regardless of what people might say. The depth of political discourse hasn't happened in that regard yet. And the challenges, I think I've listed quite a few of them over the last hour. But we can continue that if you'd like. No?
Just wanted you to expand on this.
Okay. Your question, then we can take a few more. I don't want to go too much into this because I think it'll take a lot of time, although it's a crucial question. But to put it, in a very basic sort of term, the Brotherhood operates on a type of reading of religion that is very much linked, if we're talking about the bulk of Brotherhood thinking on religion, that is very much linked to a theory of religious interpretation that goes from Muhammad Abdu down to Rashid Rida up to Hassan al-Banna. The religious establishment of Egypt and the normative historical tradition of Egyptian Islam is not like that. Okay, and you can see that they've actually tried to take steps to change the religious establishment. There are three main figures in official Egyptian Islam. Okay, the Minister of Religious Endowments, okay, the Awqaf, the Mufti position, and Sheikh al-Azhar, okay, the Sheikh of the Azhar University. The Minister of Endowments is a member of the cabinet. Mohammed Morsi's first cabinet had a Minister of Endowments, and he tried to appoint a very ultra Salafi as Minister of Endowments. The Azhar went berserk and even went to Tantawi, who was still, the Field Marshal and head of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And they pressured, and eventually he said that he was going to appoint somebody else. And it was published in Ahram, in the state newspaper, that somebody from the Azhar University was going to be appointed. Hours before the appointment actually took place and the swearing in of the cabinet in front of Morsi took place, they switched it. And they appointed somebody else who is from the Azhar University, but is a Salafi. Okay? We've already seen, we've already received reports that the Mufti position, which is going to become vacant anyway, okay, come February or March, because the Mufti is overdue for retirement. He should have actually retired this year, and the Military Council kept it going because of the fact that they didn't want to have a new Mufti in the midst of this transition. But that's over. He should retire in February or March. And we've already seen some of the possible names in that regard, and they're not coming from the Azhar establishment as such. The Sheikh al-Azhar position is really what I think is key for a lot of the different Islamist movements in Egypt, because if you control the Azhar, then you can make lasting effect, a lasting change on Egypt and also abroad. The Azhar is much wider than just Egypt. It'll be much more difficult, I think, for them to effect any change in that regard because of the fact that Ahmed al-Tayyib is Sheikh al-Azhar, and they've designed the law to make sure that the Azhar is independent, so it's going to be difficult for them to change in that regard. But I think that they will try. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I think I have 3 questions, if you may allow me. You mentioned the Salafis, and I wish to ask you your take on the Salafi movement, and what's your take on how powerful or significant it is in instilling any change? What's their contribution?
So how powerful are they in?
Instilling any kind of change or making it an impact, a significant impact, affecting the politics of the country. Is it a significant movement? Is it something that we need to keep, is it something that's worthwhile taking a pause and addressing? That wasn't in existence as far as I understand in the Mubarak at this time, maybe because it was a repressive regime, I don't know. I'm not quite sure. So that's one aspect. And the other is, I haven't been to Egypt in a while, since 2010. And I'd like to get a feel of what's the people's perception of the times that they're in now. I know it's a difficult time, more so for the people that live in Egypt. We feel for them and we're connected to them as Egyptians living outside of Egypt, but they're the one living the day-to-day struggles. What's their take on the revolution, and how do they see the future? And my last question, please, is on the Constitution, because I know we're in the process, or we probably have it. Do we have it out yet?
There's a draft.
There is a draft, yes. I think I got forwarded a copy of it. So, what's your take on the process of writing it and the essence of it in itself, the Constitution itself, and the good and bad that you see in it?
Okay. Let's take another couple more, and then another round after this.
Just want you to elaborate a little bit more, as the sister has just said, on how you define difference between Salafis and Islamic Brotherhood, their school of thought. As I understood, there is a political dimension too, which may moderate, so to speak, Salafis because of their influence by Saudis, and what I learned, I don't know how far it is true, maybe you can verify that even before the election process, there were helicopters and jets full of money were sent to Egypt to promote Salafi candidates, and they were running against Muslim Brotherhood, most of them, and what I understood is about 20% of them were elected. So one side, if you see, being in America, for the last 40-some years, what I learned about Salafis, and even I lived in Saudi Arabia for about 3.5 years too, perhaps, but I was too young at that time to understand the differences. But as what I understood, knowing what the Salafi means in America, was that it was a time I could not even speak to them about politics what I want to know is how there is one extreme in terms of conservative views of the Islamic thought, and the other side another conservative view of political participation. They are more like driven to establish a, so to speak, a governance of a khilafah than a modern democratic process. So how you see this amalgamation of Salafis into the political arena in Egyptian, the same Salafis movement. And the second, just a quick note, is and how should we define that the Egypt would be ruled by Muslim Brotherhood? If I remember correctly, the vote by was that by Hassan al-Banna or Sayyid Qutb, either one of them, that I traveled to Europe and America and I saw the Islam in practice, but I didn't see the Muslims. I traveled in the Islamic countries, I saw Muslims, but I didn't see the Islam in practice. So is that still their socio-political approach using that way? If that is the case, seems like they will be pretty much progressive in the modern times, and correlate with democratic thoughts. So just wanted to have your opinion.
Okay, let me answer these first. So, if I'll take them in reverse. The Brotherhood is not a progressive organization. And I think that we have to be very careful about describing it as moderate unless we're very clear about what we mean by moderate. Now, I hope I'm very open about the fact that I don't think that the Brotherhood is a radical organization that seeks to completely redefine the world. Okay? I don't believe that they're trying to create a caliphate in Egypt. Okay? I don't believe they're trying to change the nature of the economic order. I don't believe that they intend to go to war against Israel or anywhere else for that matter. And in fact, I might wish that they did go to war in Syria. But anyway, that's not to say that they're moderate. They're moderate in certain aspects of their approach in dealing with other political forces. They don't really rock the boat in terms of economic policies, and we've seen that particularly over the last 18 months. And they're essentially, this might be a bit cruel to say, but when it comes to economic policies, they're essentially neoliberal capitalists. And I think this is why we've seen in the past few months a lot of different voices outside of Egypt describe them as moderate, because actually they're the people you can do business with. And the Brotherhood is an extremely wealthy organization in terms of its membership. Hellyer al-Shater, who is one of the most senior members of the Brotherhood, is a very rich man. He's a very, very rich man. I'm not envious of him in that regard, I'm just pointing that out. Business is definitely how the Brotherhood operates. Now, the difference between the Brotherhood and the different Salafi movements, and I have to be very clear about this, the Brotherhood is an umbrella group, okay? It's not as cohesive as a lot of people will think, and it does have different points of view within it. The leadership of the Brotherhood is generally quite conservative. Hellyer al-Shater is far more inclined to a more Salafi point of view than some of the other leadership, but that's the nature of the Brotherhood. The different Salafi groups are different Salafi groups. You can't describe Salafism in Egypt as a single entity. And I would be very cautious about comparing it to other Salafis in other parts of the world, including in the United States or Europe for that matter. And one thing that is very true though, and I think you touched on this very, very well, political participation from within different Salafi movements in Egypt was anathema. Okay? We don't do it. We don't do politics. They changed that very quickly after the revolution. And I have some thoughts as to why that happened, but maybe we'll talk about that later. But the reality is that they did change. Not the whole of the Salafi movement. Okay? Different parts of it is still very much hands off with regards to politics. Other parts of it are obviously very active. But to go back to your question on the Salafi movement, to link this in, they were there prior to 2011. Okay, the Salafi movement has been operational in Egypt for decades. Okay, the difference is that now they're actually engaged on a political level, but they've been engaged in Egypt through charitable works, religious preaching for a very long time, and they managed to convert that social capital into political capital through the elections. Now, that's not to say that, okay, and by the way, they didn't get 20% of the vote, they got 30% of the vote. It doesn't mean that 30% of Egyptians are Salafi. Okay? The Muslim Brotherhood got 48% of the vote. Okay? It doesn't mean that 48% of Egyptians are Muslim Brotherhood members or supporters. This is not the issue. You have to keep in mind how the parliamentary system worked in Egypt and how other political forces were actually organized in the run-up to the elections. Okay? I spent some time looking at the different surveys that we did in Egypt when I was with Gallup. I used to work at Gallup, particularly during the few months after the revolution. And the polls that we did showed very clearly that right after the revolution, the very first poll that we did showed that the Salafi, people's confidence in the Salafis didn't exceed 5%. Okay? 5% of Egyptians, 4% of Egyptians, 3% of Egyptians, but not more than 5% expressed confidence in Salafis when asked. Okay? As far as the Brotherhood was concerned, 12 to 15. Okay? Now those numbers started to climb up through the course of the year, but they did not skyrocket. Okay? They were quite steady actually right up until about September, October. Elections were in December. Okay? In December, they went high. Okay? Now these people didn't become Salafi and they didn't become Muslim Brotherhood over the course of that year. They started to express confidence in them in a political way. Now, what happened between September and December is very clear from the data that we got. People who were undecided about who they were going to vote for, people who were undecided about the Brotherhood, people who were undecided about Hizb al-Nur, the Salafi political party, those people changed. Okay? They flipped from being undecided to throwing the support behind the Muslim Brotherhood Party, Freedom and Justice Party, and behind Hizb al-Nur. And there's a very easy way to understand that. Nobody else was giving most Egyptians the time of day. Okay? This is where I go into my, anti-liberal tirade, all right? Because the non-Islamist movements in Egypt have really not done their job. Okay? They haven't been out on the streets. They haven't been out of the cities. They haven't been engaged, and they weren't engaged before. Hizb al-Nur is a year old. Hizb al-Hurriya wal-Adala, the Party of Light and the Freedom and Justice Party, these are parties that are no more than a year and a half old. And yet they did so well. They didn't do so well because it's 1 year old and they just, worked so hard. They did so well because the Brotherhood has been in operation for decades and has been working on the grassroots all over Egypt for decades. And the same thing can be said for the Salafis. And they converted that into political capital. These other parties, what were they doing before the revolution? Most of them, what were they doing before the revolution? It's not a comfortable answer, because the answer is they weren't doing anything. They were making money. Okay, most of these parties were not engaged on the grassroots. Some of them were, but not much. Okay, so when you have that take place, when you have a parliamentary election take place, it's not surprising. Okay, this is also not very bad news, by the way, because look to the presidential election. The presidential election. Two top candidates, Mohamed Morsi. Why? The Brotherhood backed him, very well organized, very good, 25% of the vote. Who came in second? Ahmed Shafiq. Why? Because the National Democratic Party of Mubarak and the military pushed him to the hilt. Okay, lots of organization there. Who came in third? Hamdin Sabahi came in third. Okay, who was this guy? Nobody heard of him before. Before the revolution, who knew who Hamdin Sabahi was? Who came in fourth? Abu al-Futuh. Who is he? They came in third and fourth. Like the two of these guys put together beat Morsi and Shafiq. They didn't have a huge nationwide, organization behind them. They didn't have this massive sort of social capital to then convert. No, it was all on the basis of new organization. Okay, so it is possible. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. But one of the things that is holding back so many of the non-Islamist groups within Egypt is that they constantly fight with each other. And they don't have much of a message. They have to go beyond the anti-Islamist message, and they have to build something that's actually quite cohesive around themselves. People's perception of the time they're in. I don't think you'll like this answer. Most Egyptians think the revolution ended on February 11th, 2011. Okay, which is why when the constitutional referendum took place in March, it was overwhelmingly a yes vote because people wanted to go back to their normal lives. Okay, they thought that we won, and that's it. Now, I might think they're wrong, you might think they're wrong, but that's what the majority of Egyptians, I think, feel. The revolution for them is done. It's succeeded. It's not quite the way that I see it, and it's not quite the way that I think a lot of people that I know see it, but the overwhelming majority of Egyptians, for example, expressed confidence in the military right up until the day they left. Okay. The lowest confidence rating the military got after the revolution was 88%. The highest was 94%. It never dipped below 88%. Okay. And I beg your pardon?
Did they really leave though?
The حاجة تانية. We can get back to that another time. But the point is that people really didn't, they didn't express opposition to the military. You had a very small proportion of Egyptians that actually distrusted the military and held them accountable. Okay, so remember how you, me, this whole room interprets what happens in Egypt, through what mediums. Okay, this is very different than the overwhelming majority of Egyptians. Okay, the overwhelming majority of Egyptians get their news through state television. And we know that. We know that through the polling that we've done over the past couple of years. And this is something that really annoyed me about early commentary on the uprising. It's a Facebook revolution, it's a Twitter revolution. It's rubbish. 12% of Egyptians who were active as protesters during the 18 days, 12% used Twitter and Facebook. 12% of protesters, let alone Egypt. Okay, Egypt is not online. Okay, overwhelming majority of Egyptians are not online. It was not a Facebook revolution. It was not a Twitter revolution. And the Constitution. I'm going to not answer that question only because it may become a very moot point in the next few days. The Constitutional Assembly may be dismissed. We don't know. The courts are supposed to come out with a verdict relatively soon. If they do, then we may have a third Constitutional Assembly being formed, this time exclusively by President Mohamed Morsi. And I'm not sure actually if when he does that, if the courts then don't also have the right to dismiss that one as well, if cases are brought against it. So I won't go too much into an answer on that one. I have seen the initial draft. There's lots of things in there that concern me. But it is a constitutional document, which means that if it's not too prescriptive, then there are ways around it. When it came to Article 2 of the Constitution, Islam is the religion of the state, and the principles of the Sharia, of Islamic law, are the basis of law. That type of article has been around in the Egyptian legislative toolbox for a very long time. How the judiciary interpreted it is very different than what a lot of people now are freaking out about. Some were worried about the relationship between legislation and the Azhar. The draft is a bit unclear because now it seems that it's not a binding consultation, it's an advisory consultation. And the Azhar is smart enough. Actually, the Azhar didn't want that article. The Azhar didn't want to be in the Constitution. They wanted independence, and they didn't want to have that sort of role. So if they are forced to have some sort of role, then I'm not particularly concerned. My concern is more about what happens to the Azhar later. Because with or without a constitutional sort of, intrinsic role, if the Azhar is changed from within, which is the plan of several groups in Egypt, and not for the better, then with or without a constitutional role, that's very bad for Egypt. It could be very damaging. But again, this is an opportunity. I feel. The people of Egypt haven't simply sort of, thrown their hands up in defeat and said, oh, well, that's it, that's the constitution. I think a lot of people are organizing about it, raising awareness about it. It will go to referendum. It's not going to go to referendum on the basis of different articles. It will be passed or not passed as a whole document. And I think it will pass. I think regardless of whatever it is, it's going to pass. And it's going to pass because people want stability. Because like I said, February 11th, that's when most people think the revolution ended. So we wait to see what's going to happen with the courts. And I wouldn't count on it being over yet. He couldn't get rid of the prosecutor general. And in response, the prosecutor general, he wouldn't leave. Although I don't know why he wouldn't go to the Vatican. I thought that was a good job. But anyway, he brought a case against Aysam al-Arian and also another senior member of the Muslim Brotherhood. That was like 3 days later. So the judiciary is not down and out. And I'm waiting to see how they're going to react to this constitution. And we'll see. This country had a constitution and several amendments, not too long afterwards. These things aren't written completely in stone, and there are always ways to make changes later on, I think. But we wait and see. But none of this is surprising, I think. And there are opportunities, and again, we would not be even have the opportunity or the capacity to have this discussion if the revolution hadn't begun. So we'll wait and see.
Just one follow-up question.
Okay, sure then.
Yeah. The economy play a vital role in providing basis of any revolution, or cause and effects, so to speak. But after listening to you, if they want to, Mr. Mursi or the governing party would keep the status quo for the economic setup, the prevailing economic setup, which I don't know. I mean, ignorant of that, what it is, But disparity among the people, and the people are not empowered economically, that would cause for a worry, for another future, maybe a drastic change. Because how you see it, is this government will rely on the parliament to make their own independent decision, or they will provide some sort of a guiding light to bring economic change, especially like when we think in terms of the international relations, relying on the World Bank and IMF. That is also contingent to many other political aspects, and that can also decide, if the revolution was successful or not, and what's the really aspiration of the Brotherhood is for the last 80 plus some years, this driving force. So that is kind of concern.
Thank you. If you would like to answer that,
I think the gentleman there had a question. He's been waiting. Thank you.
Being the government is something, but governing is another, right? Now that's the dilemma that Mursi is having, I think. And being able to, being prepared to govern is another thing. Having the means, the personnel, one thing, right? And the vision is another. If you look at different other countries, for example, Turkey's political transition, right? You will see that it will take some time, right? But on the other hand, you have the revolution. It's meant to be happening fast. When people come to the streets, they want things changed fast. How you would comment on the patience of the people and the time that it will take to change things?
Well, I think those two actually link quite well together. The success of the Morsi government depends really on two things. The first is how much consensus he's going to be able to build with other political forces. And if he doesn't, then he's not going to get very much done. I doubt very much that he'll be here in 4 years' time. The second is really the economic sort of vision that he and his party have for the country. And there doesn't seem to be one. There doesn't seem to be one. And this is problematic for any successful change on the grassroots, particularly with people who live in poverty. I mean, 40% of Egyptians live around the poverty line. You know, the illiteracy rate in Egypt is sky high. And a lot of people who went on the streets, and by the way, I just want to give you a number here, 11% of Egyptians didn't support the revolution, they were active in it. Okay, they protested. They were physically on the streets. 11% of Egyptians. That's incredibly high in any country. Okay, we're talking around 12 million people. You know, now they weren't all in Tahrir Square. I have to kill another myth here. Okay, Tahrir Square can't hold 1 million people. I'm really sorry. Tahrir Square can only hold about 250,000. I'm very glad that Al Jazeera said there were 7 million because it meant people paid attention. But 12 million people around the country did. Okay, so the amount of expectations that they have are really high. I was in Tahrir Square the night that Mubarak stepped down, and I saw a group of young men parading through the square saying, "We're going to get married." Okay? Now, that sounds bizarre, but it's actually extremely understandable within the context of Egypt, because marriage in Egypt, particularly for people of less means, is extremely difficult. Okay, because it costs a lot, and the struggle that young people have to go through in order to save up enough money to do everything that needs to be done it's really quite extraordinary. And what they were really saying is, we're finally going to get a job, we're finally going to make enough money that we're actually going to be able to propose and take care of our families and so on. That's not going to change. That's not going to change for quite some time. And patience is not something that is going to be a part of that at all. Now, on the one hand, most people think the revolution is done. Okay. On the other hand, they elected Mohammed Morsi for a reason. They expected change. They expected him to do things. Okay. And President Morsi set very high standards for his presidency. He hasn't met them. You know, the 100 days are up, and despite, I mean, he gave himself a report card that was quite envious, but it wasn't really accurate, and a lot of people know that. That's going to be very difficult for any future election, because remember, he comes up for re-election. He comes up for re-election in 3.5 years, and I actually thought, and I was convinced that Mohammed Morsi that the Muslim Brotherhood would not put forward a presidential candidate. And I thought it would be extremely sensible of them, from their own perspective, to do exactly that, because it means they don't have to be held responsible for the failings that then take place. Instead, they put forward Khairat al-Shatir and Mohammed Morsi in order to make sure that they did actually have a candidate. And that went, by the way, over the heads of lots of people in the Brotherhood. Okay, I won't get into that right now, but it definitely wasn't the Brotherhood as a whole wanting to do that. But I really thought that they didn't want the presidency, and I thought they didn't want it because who would want to be responsible for governing 83 million Egyptians? I mean, it's really quite a headache. It's one of the reasons why the military council was so keen to get out of governing the whole country. It's a difficult problem, especially in the context of the aftermath of this revolution. So, in terms of building visions, I think the Egyptian political arena is lacking in that regard. There are some promising signs in certain places, but it's very polarized right now. It's really polarized. And again, I think that's normal. I wish that we weren't going through a constitutional sort of discussion right now, because that's going to be harder to change. But apart from that, this is all very normal and all very natural. And people have to stay the course and try to find ways to minimize the difficulties that are going to take place before things get settled, and really, be very steadfast about certain principles that I think are very important. I'm personally quite concerned about the increase in sectarianism in the country, particularly with regards to Coptic Egyptians. I think that's quite vital. I don't see that going away. I see that hopefully not getting much worse, but I don't see it going away. And I see more politicization of religion coming about. But I also see that there's going to be a new parliament. There's a new political discourse that is emerging and is constantly developing. And this polarization can't go on forever. And I hope that, it turns out for the best in the end. But, Egypt's a very strange place. By the rules of physics and just logic, Cairo should have collapsed ages ago. I mean, anybody who's gone to Cairo knows that all these buildings should really have just fallen down. They're built badly. You go to a gas station and the guy who's filling your car with gas is smoking a cigarette. I mean, really, the country shouldn't run. It shouldn't exist, on the level of of logic. But it does. It does. And the something that's really, quite special, at least to me. The police were withdrawn from the streets of Cairo, all over the country, actually. I don't know many countries where if that had happened, the whole country wouldn't have gone up in flames. Egypt didn't go off in flames. Egypt was quite exemplary, actually, in that regard. In London, we had police taken off just a part of London for a few hours. It was not peaceful. Cairo and Egypt went through a revolution. And we lost lives. I mean, more than 1,000 people were killed in the uprising. It was in Syria. It was in Libya. So I have a lot of hope for Egypt in that regard, and I hope that you do as well. And I do think that there are opportunities for great change in the country over the coming months, over the coming years, and I'm very hopeful for that. But I do think it's going to be bumpy along the way. So stay tuned. Thank you.
A token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much for a very informative talk. Appreciation for. Thank you again. Thank you for coming. Have a good night.